The political climate of Africa is undergoing profound transformations, and one of the central figures shaping this new reality is IBRAHIM Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. His bold voice has resonated across the continent, often addressing issues far beyond the borders of his own nation, in a dramatic turn of events that has drawn the attention of African citizens and international observers alike. Traoré has now openly demanded that the African Union investigate Kenyan President William Ruto over the ongoing protests that have gripped Kenya. This call is not just about Kenya. It speaks to the larger question of governance, accountability, and the role of continental institutions like the AU in safeguarding democracy and stability in Africa. To understand the gravity of this speech and its implications, we must examine the context of Kenya's turmoil, the role of William Ruto, the significance of the African Union, and the vision Traoré is putting forward for Africa's future. Kenya, one of East Africa's most prominent nations, has long been considered a hub for business, trade, and political influence. With a population exceeding 50 million and a position as an anchor state in the region, its stability is critical, not only for its citizens, but also for the security and prosperity of the entire East African community. Yet recent years have seen Kenya rocked by economic challenges, political disputes, and waves of protest that reflect growing dissatisfaction among ordinary citizens. Rising living costs, allegations of corruption, disputed elections, and questions about governance have fueled demonstrations that often escalate into violent confrontations between protesters and security forces. In this turbulent climate, President William Ruto has faced criticism from both opposition leaders and civil society, who accuse his administration of failing to address pressing concerns while allegedly consolidating power in ways that undermine democratic accountability. It is against this backdrop that IBRAHIM Traoré's voice has entered the conversation with force. Speaking not as a distant observer, but as a fellow African leader who believes in the shared destiny of the continent, Traoré declared that the African Union cannot remain silent while Kenyan citizens take to the streets in anger and desperation. He argued that the AU has a responsibility not only to mediate conflicts between states, but also to ensure that leaders within states uphold democratic principles and respect the rights of their people. By demanding an investigation into Ruto's handling of the protests, Traoré has placed himself at the center of a debate about sovereignty, accountability, and the future of African governance. The very framing of his speech is significant. Traoré positioned himself not as an adversary of Ruto personally, but as a defender of African citizens who, in his words, deserve justice, transparency, and respect. He emphasized that the credibility of the African Union itself is at stake. If the AU continues to limit its actions to ceremonial meetings and declarations without addressing real crises affecting millions of Africans, then its relevance will erode. For Traoré, the case of Kenya represents a test. Will the AU act decisively, or will it allow the people of Kenya to face their struggles without continental solidarity? This demand is especially bold because it challenges traditional norms of African diplomacy, which often prioritize non-interference in the internal affairs of states. For decades, many African leaders have resisted outside scrutiny, citing sovereignty as a shield against criticism. Traoré, however, has flipped the script by insisting that sovereignty belongs first and foremost to the people, not to leaders. He argued that when governments suppress protests violently, when citizens are silenced, and when democratic promises are betrayed, it is no longer a matter of internal politics, but a continental concern. This argument echoes his broader philosophy that Africa must reinvent itself, shedding the legacies of colonial exploitation and weak institutions in favor of genuine self-determination and collective responsibility. To fully appreciate the depth of his words, one must understand Traoré's own trajectory. Rising to power in Burkina Faso during a time of crisis, he has positioned himself as a symbol of resistance against foreign interference, corruption, and the exploitation of African resources. His speeches consistently emphasize dignity, independence, and the need for Africans to control their own destiny. By calling for an AU investigation into Ruto, Traoré is extending that philosophy into the realm of governance, insisting that accountability cannot stop at the borders of Burkina Faso, but must be a continental standard. The reactions to his demand have been mixed, reflecting the polarized nature of African politics. Supporters across the continent, especially among youth, praised him for saying what many have long thought, but few leaders dared to articulate. In Kenya itself, opposition, figures, and civil society groups welcomed the statement as a sign that their struggles were being heard beyond their borders. For them, Traoré's intervention is a validation of their grievances and a reminder that African leaders should answer to African people, not just to foreign creditors or elites. On the other hand, critics accused Traoré of overstepping, arguing that Kenya's internal matters should be resolved domestically without external pressure. Some suggested that his stance was designed to boost his own political image as a revolutionary leader rather than to genuinely help Kenya. Yet, to dismiss his speech as mere posturing would be to underestimate its significance. The truth is that the African Union has long been criticized for its ineffectiveness. Many Africans see it as a body that issues statements but fails to take meaningful action. By challenging the AU to investigate a sitting president over protests, Traoré is calling for a redefinition of the AU's mission, one that is more people-centered rather than leader-centered. If the AU were to take his demand seriously, it would set a precedent for holding leaders accountable in ways that could transform the institution's credibility. For the first time, the AU would not just be about governments talking to each other, but about governments being answerable to their people through a continental mechanism. Beyond institutional reform, the speech also touched on the deep frustrations of African youth. Across the continent, young people make up the majority of the population, yet they are often marginalized in decision-making. They face high unemployment, lack of opportunities, and political systems that seem unresponsive to their needs. In Kenya, much of the protest movement has been driven by the youth, who feel betrayed by political promises that never materialized. By siding with them, Traoré has tapped into a powerful well of solidarity. His words resonate because they reflect a lived reality that millions experience daily. He has positioned himself not just as a president, but as a voice of a generation demanding change. The geopolitical implications are also worth considering. Kenya is a key ally of the West, with strong ties to the United States, the European Union, and international financial institutions. It hosts numerous multinational corporations, international agencies, and plays a strategic role in regional security. Any investigation into President Ruto's government by the AU would therefore have ripple effects far beyond Africa. It could strain relations with Western partners who see Kenya as a stable anchor in an otherwise volatile region. Traoré's call for an investigation thus carries a defiant undertone, signaling to the world that African accountability cannot be subordinated to geopolitical convenience. At the same time, Traoré's stance highlights the shifting alliances in Africa. More and more, African leaders are looking beyond the West for partnerships, engaging with countries in Asia, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. This diversification of alliances gives leaders like Traoré greater confidence to challenge Western-backed leaders without fear of isolation. By speaking against Ruto, he is not only challenging a fellow African leader, but also challenging the systems of external support that sustain leaders who fail to address the needs of their citizens. The heart of the speech, however, remains the people. Traore returned repeatedly to the theme that African citizens deserve dignity and justice. He pointed out that protests are not random acts of chaos, but expressions of frustration when political systems fail to deliver. Instead of criminalizing protesters, leaders should listen to them, engage with them, and reform systems that have clearly lost the trust of the people. He warned that ignoring the voices of citizens only breeds instability, radicalization, and deeper divisions. The message was clear. Africa's future depends on its leaders' willingness to listen to their people, rather than suppress them. The delivery of the speech was as striking as its content. Traoré's tone was firm but measured, avoiding inflammatory language while making his point unmistakably. He did not indulge in personal attacks but framed his words around principles of justice, accountability, and solidarity. This rhetorical strategy allowed him to criticize Ruto's government indirectly while still appearing as a defender of African unity. It also reinforced his image as a serious leader who seeks solutions rather than simply stirring controversy. The long-term impact of this speech will depend on the African Union's response. If the AU ignores the demand, it will reinforce the perception that it is out of touch with ordinary Africans. If it takes action, even symbolic, it could open a new chapter in its history. For Traoré, the speech itself is already a victory, as it cements his reputation as a bold leader willing to challenge entrenched norms. For Kenya, it adds pressure on the government to address the grievances fueling protests and to show greater accountability. For Africa as a whole, it is a reminder that the continent's destiny lies not only in economic liberation, but also in political transformation. The symbolism of one African leader demanding accountability for another is profound. For too long, African politics has been dominated by silence in the face of abuses, with leaders protecting each other rather than their citizens. Traoré has broken that silence. Whether or not his call leads to immediate action, it has shifted the discourse. It has shown that new standards of governance are possible, and that African leaders can and should hold each other accountable. In doing so, he has aligned himself with the aspirations of millions who yearn for a continent where justice and dignity are not empty words, but lived realities. As the dust settles from this bold declaration, one thing is clear. IBRAHIM Traoré has once again positioned himself as one of the most consequential voices of his generation. His demand for the AU to investigate William Ruto is not just about Kenya. It is about Africa itself, about whether the continent will continue down a path of weak institutions and unaccountable leadership, or whether it will rise to meet the demands of its people. The protests in Kenya are a mirror of frustrations felt across Africa, and Traoré's speech has turned that mirror into a rallying cry. For Africa's youth, for its civil societies, and for its future, the question now is whether other leaders will have the courage to join him in this call for accountability, or whether they will remain silent as the people demand change.